All right, welcome. My name is David Rue. I'm the chair of postgraduate programs here, and it's my pleasure to welcome Kutan Ayata to the lecture tonight. Kutan Ayata is an associate professor and the vice chair in the Department of Architecture and Urbanism at UCLA, where he is also serving as director of the Master of Architecture program. He is also one half of Young Ayata, a firm based bicoastally in New York and Los Angeles. In addition to the numerous awards and accolades they have received, Kutan and his partner Michael Young have accrued, I would say, a lot of street cred in schools of architecture these days. It's a testament to their dedication as teachers, but also their contributions and activity in the production of our contemporary discourse, which brings me to mention briefly the problem of parafiction. Around 2005, I've known Kutan for quite a long time. A number of us on the East Coast started to become preoccupied with a type of artwork that was beginning to emerge in the art world. The art historian Carrie Lambert-Betty, she defines parafiction as artistic performances or presentations that depict fictions as facts. And she has been interested for a number of years in why this happened in the art world and the alterations in cultural perceptions based on this type of activity. She also points out that it was, and I found this quite interesting, in 2015, the Oxford English Dictionary, in their annual nomination of Word of the Year, in 2015 declared the word of the year was post-truth. 2015 was the year of Brexit, the beginnings of the Trump campaign, as we all know. It didn't begin then, of course, because this has been happening for a while. We would also look at, say, the work of the great philosopher Bruno Latour, who did profound epistemological work examining how the production of knowledge and fact in our society may in fact be on clay feet. Latour himself was accused, hilariously in some interviews, of, oh, you're the philosopher of post-truth, aren't you? And he was utterly horrified by that. No, it's not that at all. It's more, how can we put our epistemologies on a firmer foundation? I think now that we're in a kind of post-COVID world, I think the task of reestablishing the problem of fact and knowledge, I think, remains probably one of our most urgent tasks. Now, why do I mention this, and why did we become interested in parafiction in the first place? Well, I think as architects, it may be that we have been engaged in a problem of parafiction all along, because isn't it our task to produce representations of that which does not yet exist? And the challenge is to convince our constituencies that, in fact, that thing that is not yet real could be real. And throughout architectural history, there have been many strategies and techniques for asserting how, through the practice of architecture, we might indeed edit reality. So this brings me back to Kutan, and it looks like tonight he will look through, in retrospect, the various competitions that they have done, and their recent competition win, I hope he'll show. I'd like to see what that's like in more detail, and some of their built work. what happens when the parafiction then goes beyond the fictional and actually enters into brick and mortar and concrete and steel? That's what I'd like to find out. So please welcome Kutan Ayata.
All right, David, thank you so much for the intro. I will kind of indirectly weave in and out, and I hope to do that by some of the work that we produced. Also, want to thank to Hernan for the invitation. This is an incredible place to come always, where one gets inspired about architecture. And I hope I can return the favor by inspiring the students back and everyone here. I wanted to do something a little different for this talk. Kind of as my role as an educator kind of gets a little bit more serious with my appointment at UCLA, kind of think about how a generation projects forward, how a generation kind of carries their concern within the agency of architecture, especially in current condition where anxieties run high, climatic pressures begin to kind of really become exuberantly real in the way we experience them, to hopefully not lose sight of one's creativity and agency dealing with what's in front of us. In some way, kind of talking about the competitions here today is not directly talking about competitions. It's talking about self-motivation and having a drive to test ideas, and competitions are one way of doing that. For me personally, this predates my graduate school. It started during undergrad school. Worked in offices, worked more on competitions than actual projects. It's a habit that allows one to flex muscles, test ideas, free from pressure of clients and perhaps realities of the world until they have a client and reality, and that'll be part of this talk as well. As David mentioned, we're partners in crime with Michael Young, so all the work that you see here is our kind of joint effort in the last, covering about 10 years to this moment. Before I get into the competitions and hopefully begin to kind of trail back certain steps that will feed into questions of fiction, parafiction, and the real. And I would like to do that through mostly our work only. Typically, this kind of lecture starts with references to the kind of practices that David was mentioning, especially within photography, and venture into the work as a typical reference. This one I want to do it through our built work. So we're going to take a short detour around the window. This is Kaunas' Elements exhibition in Venice Biennale in 2014, where architecture is dissected into various pieces and exhibited as objects, almost bringing to one's consciousness in terms of what is it that makes architecture, piece by piece, literally. The building I'm talking about hopefully refuses to fit any one category here. It's an opening. It's not a shape, at least it's not singular. It does what a window does, but it doesn't necessarily sit comfortably in the categories that we've seen in the previous page. It cannot be plastered on a wall. It cannot be reduced to a style. It has other parts. It's a negotiation of two materials, maybe three actually, if you count the frame. In the way this deepening of a surface begins to develop a suggestion of diaphanousness. You can kind of perhaps see through, let it reflect, and perhaps when you're inside, you'll figure out a way to look out. In plan, it begins to do things to a very normative plan, in this case, a building that holds residential units. Windows turning away from a planar organization of the surface, just a simple box, begins to produce visual conditions, visual access from the depths of the building in a narrow building site towards the front and back vistas. The window itself is, at least in the digital kind of world we work in as architects, is a speculation at first to meet reality. How is it going to be built? How is it going to be kind of realized, entering material practices that we think we're familiar, and we think when we're familiar, we make suggestions and really don't understand that the corner is the worst thing in concrete, so they begin to break. What we think cheap is not necessarily the best outcome, let's say, for this version. And an expertise on site suggests, why don't we bend quads and triangles of wood to make a ruled surface where we can cast this with wood mold work, that we could transfer woodiness of wood, the grains, into the concrete, every architect's dream. The problem with this is once you cast it with this, you cannot release the formwork, everything you cast will break. So then the woodiness of wood gets transferred into fiberglass, a mold that one person can carry, flex out of place, use it, reuse it in all 34 instances of the project. But the window is not simply a cut. The window is kind of a thickened slab, a thickened sill that results in a specific geometry and a kind of deepening of the concrete wall. You don't cast it monolithically, you end up with a cold joint wherever you have an edge. So trying to figure out in a condition where vibration of the concrete is low-tech, how do you cast something that doesn't have a cold joint as a single piece? And they know how to do that in Mexico. It's kind of quite incredible how kind of just common expertise in understanding how concrete behaves can just quick manipulations on the site without really any design drawings, etc. The precision that we obsess with as architects kind of takes up a life of its own to kind of produce these kinds of mock-ups. And this is where we begin to kind of see the trapezoid that begins to foreshorten as you walk around becomes a rectangle. The window from which you would look out begins to let you look out and in and again out, potentially. But all the kind of, let's say, precision of a software where we calculate inches, where we think we're going to get everything that we're dreaming, begins to be mediated by human labor. So the question of high-tech and low-tech in the way we kind of work is a real thing, especially in projects where budgets are low, budgets are scarce, and you're basically working kind of for market rate housing, really. But here's a negotiation of what is modeled, what is drawn, translated through fiberglass, fighting against reinforcement by sheer force of hand, by an army of people trying to make sure that little sheet of fiberglass suspended in the air at the exact location so it can produce this thing. So this thing is interesting. You look from outside, you encounter it, it deepens, it doesn't suggest too much beyond itself because it's tinted glass. But once you go in, because it's backlit from one side, one of them is not, because you're always perpendicular, begins to stand alone. So the window all of a sudden becomes an object that kind of comfortably misfits or missits in the room. Do you go around the window? Do you look behind it to look outside? If that's the window, what's the other side? Is it just an aperture? So in the way the light hits and begins to dematerialize glass, something else begins to happen as well, that the soffit on the interior extends and begins to define an extended kind of space behind that window. That begins to separate rooms. You can look from one room into the other. That begins to produce other kinds of spaces where the window no longer exists as a planar condition, but begins to make little spaces. And ultimately, it begins to kind of establish a different kind of relationship with the outside. What seems to be kind of perhaps withdrawn, inaccessible, is not what it actually is. The windows are fairly large. It opens up outside to the inside in a dramatic way. But the window, the operable window, kind of persists its kind of idle state, being suspended. Oops. Kind of this effect of, because the window also turns the corners, your ability to kind of look next to the glass, see outside, see inside, see outside again successively, begins to define a different kind of, let's say, bay window experience, a bay window that doesn't pull out, but a bay window that pushes in. Ultimately, these openings begin to define a character of the project, a character that not necessarily reveals its programmatic specificity, what it holds, what it signifies in terms of what's in it. It stands alone. It's just not what you think it is when you see it. It does develop a character that seems perhaps brutal, perhaps off-putting, perhaps inaccessible, but it doesn't necessarily speak to what we assume to be an architectural, I shouldn't say architectural, residential typology. But when the time of the day shifts and kind of interior lighting begins to come alive, all that harshness begins to disappear. And it begins to produce a different material quality. Things begin to soften, things begins to get porous, and still not necessarily revealing a kind of a clear reading of how the space is organized, what it's trying to kind of inhabit. There is no clue. But I think it's this moment that we as a practice we're really interested, where something through a kind of multiple reading begins to suggest an opening in the way it can be interpreted. We're not new to this, we're not the only ones, but in some way, if the setup begins to suggest something that you encounter is not what it seems upon close study, close examination, experiencing it, right, begins to suggest other outcomes, changes your assumptions about what you assume the real to be. These two images are, for me, the more interesting ones, especially our discourse kind of develops more in this line, where our work, I think, compared to its early days, none of which I'm going to show, was attempting to kind of be loud, be out there unapologetically, comfortably misfit, uncomfortably fit. We're kind of more interested in this condition, which I'm calling comfortably, uncomfortably misfit. Sorry, I rehearsed that, but it didn't go as I hoped. If it was confusing, probably is. All right. I'm gonna go almost chronologically. And I'm going to take it through different competitions. Some of it was published, probably seen, but want to do it in a way that's kind of a little light. Hopefully, you'll get the humor that's within, which I deeply kind of relate to parafictional practices as well. They're organized like Friends episodes. This one was super fun. This is the Young Architects program, collaboration between MOMA and Istanbul Modern. We were invited to participate, invited competition. The site is right on the Bosphorus. This is the strait that connects Black Sea, the Sea of Marmara, and eventually to the Aegean and Mediterranean. Where basically Europe and Asia kind of collide together. The site itself, a former depot on the harbor front, is just this courtyard covered with gravel. And the fence that you see on the water side is basically international territory. So it's like PS1, entrance to the museum, calling in young practices to speculate on what a temporary structure pavilion might be like. And, all of us know in its recent history, the kind of attention shifted from experiments in, let's say, design and fabrication towards how do we begin to think about the cycle of materials that make the pavilion and how they return to either other uses, landfill, or responsibly consumed to produce a proposal. In some way, this governs the mandate, both in terms of budget and what you're expected to do. Those of you who have ventured into that impossible task with MOMA. We said we will use what are categorically understood to be absolutely horrible materials. In this case, PVC hose, PVC ties, not because they are with us for a long time, and that's a bad thing. What could be the potentials of something that could be with us for a long time, and what kind of afterlife it could have once the pavilion is done? So the inertness of the materials was actually a necessary properties for the project to have a double kind of utility in its lifespan, maybe a lifespan that goes way beyond our life cycles. Basically, standard construction materials, casings to cast concrete footings, gravel for ground, PVC, hose and rebar to kind of structure this umbrella-like condition. Sleeve the hoses between the rebars, drape them on the ground to begin to make various sizes of spaces for people to walk over, gather around, and some of them sleeve back and forth. So the umbrellas begin to develop moments where they droop down, moments where they define edges and openings into their space underneath. Zip ties begin to get tight next to one another, thousands of them, and the hope was this thing would be kind of flexible. It would kind of move with the wind that's prevalent on the site. And of course, then rock as furniture, nothing necessarily designed. Every competition has an afterlife, and this was no exception. I'll get into that in a little bit more in later projects. But using it as an opportunity to kind of test some of the drawing ideas that we've been experimenting at the time in terms of what might be the way to represent, without animation, a kind of a flickering effect within the media of drawing, digital kind of mark making. In the way how these hoses might behave, how they might move, how that might translate into a representation within drawing. But these canopies were kind of deployed in a specific manner in here, creating various kinds of edges, not really providing all that much shade, admittedly. But in some way, the hope was kind of their sheen, the atmosphere that they would create, experience on approach would be enticing enough of a place to venture in and move through. The way this is understood in terms of a construction was very simple. Bolted down, cast 1.5 feet of concrete with the rebars in it. Rebars are not held within the concrete, of course. Providing kind of a flexible support for the sleeving hoses, and fill the hoses up to the waistline with water. So in some way, you're always walking amongst what's beneath your feet. And what's beneath your feet is actually the dock that's on pillars. Below the site is actually the Bosphorus itself. The afterlife perhaps was the fun part. The afterlife basically took this image as an idea, like what happens to the things that use their utility, they use their function, which begin to perhaps enable another kind of ecology, kind of enable spaces for other species, other things than humans. So could we take ours, cut the bottom, throw the rock, throw the concrete, use it as an anchor, cut the hoses, and all the material properties that gave us shiver and movement by force of gravity and wind, all of a sudden began to kind of float and float with the buoyancy of water to perform different physical realities. And we literally kind of suggested to kind of take the whole thing and place it under the deck. What's kind of interesting for us is it's only at that moment to kind of imagine a fictional future for the project that the project itself began to get more charge. The reality of Bosphorus is because it flows just incredibly fast in both directions, the still life is so aggressive, things begin to get encrusted just incredibly fast. So our kind of assumption was this thing in a few years, and there wasn't an exact estimate obviously, would kind of turn into a calcified kind of condition and begin to promote some kind of habitat. The sciences of what kind of habitat was not necessarily resolved or speculated on, but at least the reality of it kind of going down and projecting that kind of idea was the focus of the animation one, the one that every contestant is asked to do. The typical thing to do in this is have a fly-through or have some kind of idea of assembly, etc. But taking this fiction further to kind of really situate it in a larger media, we kind of turned to YouTube. We needed alibis. And the alibis gave us kind of interesting ideas in terms of how these things are already in the world.
I want to talk to you today about fish habitat. I'm standing in front of an 8-acre lake. In the past 20 years, lots of different types of structure have been added to the lake, whether it be pallets or brush, old Christmas trees. After many years of field trials, we've developed a much better and more permanent solution to enhancing your fish habitat with our honey hole trees and shrubs. Now, the body and limbs are made from polyethylene, which is flexible, lightweight, and will not rot or deteriorate. Each unit gives you a very dense structure with lots of surface area without the snagging problems that you typically have with your traditional types of cover. Now, there's several important reasons to add structure to your pond or lake. And one is to give your mature fish, like your bass and crappie, a place to ambush prey. These predators are going to feed more effectively and have much better growth rates if they can use cover to find their food. Now, our honey hole tree was designed to be used in water depths of 6 foot or more. And typically, you're going to want to add all your structure in the top 10 to 15 foot of the lake, because that's where your fish are most of the time. We'll place 12 shrubs and 9 trees per acre, typically in groups of 2 to 3. Adding structure has to be part of your management plan. You're going to need deep water structure.
เทิงสดใหม่ในรอบวันกับนายเทนในไลฟ์กันแล้วนะคะฝนมารายงานตัวแล้วค่ะพร้อมจัดเต็มทั้งบันเทิงไทยบันเทิงต่างประเทศให้คุณผู้ชมได้ดูก่อนรู้ก่อนที่นี่ที่เดียวนะคะบอกเลยค่ะว่าวันนี้เราคัดแต่ข่าวฮอตๆทั้งนั้นนะคะไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องกลุ้มของโดมปกรณ์ลำค่ะที่ค่ายเพลงส่อแววจะเจ๊งซะแล้วรวมถึงเรื่องความรักของจุ๋ยรัตยากับแฟนหนุ่มนะคะหลังจากที่เคยหวานฉ่ำตอนนี้ก็ต้องถอยห่างกันคนละก้าวผิดกับคู่ของหมากคิมค่ะที่ฝ่ายชายพูดน่าคิดนะคะว่าตอนนี้คิมเบอร์รี่เป็นมากกว่าแฟนแล้วนะจ๊ะขณะที่คุณนายเมืองพัทยาพิงกี้เสาวิกานะคะก็ต้องโร่พบตำรวจค่ะหลังจากที่มีชื่อไปพัวพันกับคดียักยอกทรัพย์สถานเมืองค่ะ
ส่วนสถานการณ์ภาคใต้เมื่อช่วงเช้าที่ผ่านมานะครับเกิดเหตุปะทะกันระหว่างกองกำลังทหารเฉพาะกิจที่ 45 จังหวัดนราธิวาสกับกลุ่มผู้ก่อเหตุความไม่สงบทำให้มีผู้เสียชีวิต1 คนครับ
มาถึงเรื่องนี้ต้องขยายกับภัทรวีค่ะพี่เต๋าจะพาไปชมกันนะคะว่าทำไมดาราถึงนิยมมีแฟนเป็นไฮโซคะ
สวัสดีค่ะคุณผู้ชมก็เป็นข่าวดีพาดหัวหนังสือพิมพ์ทุกฉบับส่งท้ายปีเก่าที่ผ่านมาเลยนะคะสำหรับข่าวหวานๆค่ะไฮโซหนุ่มหล่อน็อตวิสรุตคุกเข่าขอชมพู่อารยาแต่งงานแล้วก็บรรจงสวมแหวนเพชร8 กะรัตราคาเบาๆนะคะกว่า10 ล้านบาทเป็นการตีตราจองไว้ก่อน
Talk to you.
Yeah. The rest is, like moving through stills and more of a typical animation. But it's, it's funny until it's not funny. Nobody laughed when we presented. And it just totally fell flat. I guess this is a little bit of suspending the assumptions of the real as a projection. The first question is, but what did they say, right? They're not playing along with the kind of humor that you assume is helping you. But nonetheless, it kind of got us thinking quite a bit in terms of kind of the need to kind of operate through multiple media and what that means in terms of what we hold kind of central in our practice, which is realism, and how what that means perhaps differently within photography, how that might mean differently within broadcasting, how that might mean different in drawing, and other things that we work as architects. So kind of the conventions through which we enter the world of mediation is where we see kind of a lot of room for experimentation in our everyday labor to deal with these questions. This is the one that got away, and it's the Bauhaus Museum in Dessau, 2-stage open international competition, not for the architecture collection, but for the broader Bauhaus collection, which is frankly far more interesting, far more risky, far more strange than the legacy, the architectural legacy of what we know and celebrate within our discipline. Super strange objects, costumes, textiles, all within a certain structure and rigor of geometry that begins to produce out-of-phase effects. All the things that really drove our kind of work in the competition. But compelled us to imagine Bauhaus as an institution that deviated from what determined its legacy 100 years ago, but it was more of a forward-facing kind of stance we took in terms of what Bauhaus could mean now and projecting into the future, which clearly was the fault line in the trajectory of the competition. The competition is actually, there are 7 buildings scattered around in Dessau. The competition site is kind of right here in a public park in the corner. Just to step back, just prior to this competition, we did a proposal for the Guggenheim Helsinki just a year before. We began to kind of experiment with intersection and dialogue of multiple volumes to produce an architectural condition. This itself, kind of columns ballooning up to volumes, then reducing down to nozzles to scoop up light, resulted in a body. This was the start of naming these things like, I don't know, headless chickens and other kinds of minions, things. But in the way they configured in the Helsinki project was at the end more of a shell, where the interiority was experienced being kind of on the other side of these surfaces. And we wanted to take that one step further as an experiment. So in the Bauhaus, the geometry gets far more disciplined. It establishes a datum at an elevated level as to kind of elevate the building so the park can flow underneath. They kind of join as 2s, 3s, 4s. In some instances, they're doubling within a single footprint. But in some way, they are making kind of a whole out of parts where it's hard to break it down. And the way nozzles are cut, orient, begin to talk to one another, and the way they kind of cuddle together, clump together, begins to produce kind of a specific local architectural expression, because the whole becomes impossible to kind of nail down as a singular entity, as a larger gesture. I'm not sure if you ever show this. This is kind of the image of the first stage. And it was winter, I don't know. Like the future we imagined for Dessau was more bleak than Dessau. And like somebody in good graces maybe thought they could do better. They could have a more kind of positive outlook, perhaps, towards the future. And we were shortlisted into 30 practices. But ultimately, what the geometry does, what the kind of organization of the project is, basically a 45-degree grid, squares and circles. It's kind of concentric squares and circles negotiating the intersections in the way they come together, and the nozzles that begin to kind of rotate around that center to make contact with the ones they want to touch, the ones they want to intersect, or with the ones from which they want to look away, kind of establishing a behavior to a very disciplined kind of behavior. There's a color scheme to this in the way it sits into the park. It continues the line of trees that exist on the northern and southern edge and along the street edge and across the corner, connects that gap to create kind of a courtyard for the park, but also a courtyard that exists within itself. The colors kind of mute on the outside, slightly varying as one goes around, and highly articulate as it looks onto itself, as to determine a completely separated kind of spatial condition. Holding the corner actually is 2 volumes that touch the ground on the right and the left, with the back of the house on the right and the entry to the left, but holding that diagonal of the park as the main entry as it slides under. On approach, you begin to kind of encounter these things. They're not singular, they are not total. They kind of translate behaviors across their seams. Sometimes color continues, sometimes the glitch of the geometry continues. The light nozzles as a feature, small or large, begin to kind of move from one to the other. It lines up with the street in a way to kind of create some kind of an urban, I don't want to call it a gesture, but perhaps a rhythm that holds the street line, begins to participate in the verticality that occurs. But on the park side, again, the muted color kind of settles the canopy of the trees, and the elevated volumes through the pilotis begin to hopefully become part of that park experience as a porous piloti condition. If you go under the piloti, you ended up in this kind of crazy coloration where the columns sit on flower beds and kind of be in this little nook that's kind of stands alone compared to everything else on the site. The plan is on the ground. It again touches on two moments. The columns, just like the nozzles, behave in a way as singular, doubles, sometimes triples. On the upper level, there are two parts to the collection. On the upper part, you have the more open, flexible exhibition that's for let's say, traveling exhibitions. And below, which is really an enfilade where you go from room to room to room, or different kind of nozzles to the others. There's 7 parts of the collection that is permanent, organized in that circulation. The project presents itself as the collection of many things, never suggesting any kind of unity, never suggesting a singularity in terms of how the form could be understood. But as you kind of ascend through the lobby, you realize the interior is one floor that is accessed into that unified nozzle condition of the four volumes into one, and there are 2 of those across the bridges. But really, it's circulated on a single level. You have to cross the bridge to go from permanent to temporary gallery, and there's an administrative mezzanine hanging above all of this. Getting into things like how this would be done, concrete base, vertical walls, and prefabricated tops, etc. But the kind of interesting thing for us has always been kind of the changing and shifting qualities of how something that seemingly reads singular, multiple from outside, begins to produce these unified spaces, things that cannot be really reconciled as large spaces being expressed on the outside, beginning to produce larger footprint, clear spans by way of these nozzles coming together. So the second stage was really a space. By the way, we thought we would never get to the second stage, so we really, just for our own purposes, as we do after each competition, continue to work on the project. And by the time we heard we would move, we were really far along to be able to speculate on how this could be built, down to the structure, ventilation systems, etc., etc. And that probably helped us in the outcome. The kind of interesting effect of this, and that's the outcome of the geometry, as the circumference going up reduces, the ability to kind of tile this thing up becomes impossible if you want to keep a perfect alignment. Things would begin to get out of line, out of phase. Things would begin to appear like they're glitching. How could we produce that glitching? There's a robotic company, tile company, that's already there for a long time, color sorting every single tile, setting them in plates, just like producing like foot by foot tiles, the kind that you put in your bathroom. But it's down to breaking the resolution of an image that you can give to them. So the idea of how that inescapable condition of the changing of circumference could produce a kind of misalignment be turned into the way we could render the project. So that kind of become a willful attempt in how to misalign as the geometry goes up, and that begins to produce a kind of low resolution effect on a form that seems to be very precise from a distance. We anticipated it would be built on deep piles, concrete base, prefabricated egg crate kind of structure. We heard we won. We won with one another firm. So there were two first prizes. Two first prizes meant there was a third stage invented. And we went through that third stage, team building, etc., trips to Germany, trying to make people believe this is going to be on budget, on time. They didn't buy it. So Bauhaus Dessau was built. It was opened 2019. Obviously, we didn't get to do it, but the kind of more efficient, a clear kind of outcome was determined to represent what the future of Bauhaus was going to be. And that was very clear in the selection. This is kind of the crisis with institutions that have a legacy. How do they determine their future is really kind of a problem unless they get over their own legacy that has built over the last 100, 150 years. But projects have afterlives. Bauhaus was no exception. Any geometry really is kind of an underlay for us to kind of put our efforts in imagining what other outcomes, what other kind of scaffolding it could present to us to experiment with what we have produced. You kind of imagine the afterlife after losing the competition to see if it had been built, what could it be potentially? Perhaps not a museum, perhaps in the future of kind of a Dessau, it was actually a refuge from radiation. This was an article we wrote with all kinds of invented kind of parafictional scenarios, images, in the conventions of a scientific journal. Like if we stop drawing like how we draw and we start drawing like a scientist, field journalist, how does that affect our own aesthetics? How do we emulate that? How do we begin to operate within this kind of mixed media condition that oscillates between text, graphs, imaging, mapping, and how to produce kind of a make-believe condition in which architecture could produce? After all, I think David said it right too, in some way we're in the business of imagining the future reality of our world. There are different conventions and tools through which we operate, and it's kind of interesting to see kind of limits to those does not end with the discipline. The experiments with the formal logics of kind of trying to break down a singular gesture to build multiples, lose the reading and significance of kind of one architectural entity, I think took a turn with us with this project. Just quick 4 things. We kind of do this for every project. You know, not a Pinterest board, but still a mood board in which trying to maybe look at certain practices that influence us continually, but see kind of qualities and conditions that we could exploit in our work. I think we all do, whether our references come from within or outside of the discipline that influence our aesthetics, our judgments in the way we design. So Scharer's kind of unknown kind of other side of the buildings, the strong figure, can price kind of this abstraction of the cut, which is sculptures where the material begins to behave in radically different ways in the way it's polished, or the cool hand look, the abstraction of that cut that denies kind of access, right, to the personality or to what's held behind that screen, comes kind of qualities that we examined in this project. Another maybe disciplinary source we were getting more interested, especially in the aftermath of thinking through unfloods, kind of this notion of how different part buildings, at least in plan, as we see them more and more, have kind of autonomous parts begin to make wholes. While in plan, this works wonderful and it's exhilarating, the outcomes of its tectonics, usually either kind of an intersection, maintaining of another project for the exterior that operates independently from what's inside. But we were kind of interested in whether in the exchange between these volumes, going beyond intersection, going beyond kind of putting two things together, a third condition, an another condition, an emergent condition could be produced that could be spatially productive and interesting. The site is really kind of a swampy park that doesn't have a end. The mandate was to build a hard edge, like the bank across the river, and situate a concert hall and a black box theater onto the site. The way the project sits is kind of thinking about an enfilade of landscape rooms, two of which would be the building. There is no hierarchy between what the building, the parking lot, the plaza, or other set of plazas do in the way they come together, but they're all kind of situated in relationship to one another. The building is negotiation of two boxes intersecting, or reaching, or kissing, or somehow talking to one another. There's an exchange in that moment that allows us to develop a shift in character from the boxy nature, which is oriented towards the street, to the old city that begins to develop another kind of architecture, one that appears with a gable, with a mansard, with a turret on one side, but begin to kind of produce a depth that does not happen on the other side. In fact, this is the front of the building. It just requires you to go under the kiss. The effort was also to reinforce in the way we're imaging projects, move away from the heroic shot of a render, really think about it, kind of set of episodes that begin to tell a story while having gaps. Having gaps allows one to kind of build what's in between them, a room for speculation. But this bit has kind of slate shingles, a roof material not being roof, and the concrete perhaps not being where it's supposed to be. But this moment where you're supposed to go under towards the river to turn around to enter is where the conventional use of these materials exchange locations in the way one surface twists under the other. The entire move is really to open up the movement through, but also really to make that one window that the building has on its facade. On the street side, that abstraction of the cut that relieves that figure of the two things kind of coming together, kind of small contact on the other side as you see approach turns itself into a kind of rather large volumetric expression. Another kind of condition around the black box and the foyer is the restaurant and administrative offices on top overlooking to river itself. The plan really negotiates the movement both in the landscape, in the way one enters the building underneath the bridge, and how these two very different kind of performance spaces are organized. One being flexible on the left, the other one is being acoustically kind of imagined concert hall on the right. The moment they kiss is when the foyers kind of connect. They have different foyers on different levels, but as you go up, the two volumes depart from one another. The kind of the typical atrium as a void is kind of ignored in this one. The verticality is really kind of pushed forward as a figural section that looks down on a restaurant but also looks up to the waiting kind of platforms above. The moment where the building and the landscape begin to produce this cut and transaction between the two. But the materiality of the shingles continue to kind of break in terms of where they should be and begin to move into the space itself, all the way to the moment of where the transaction happened through a white soffit into a darker kind of deep section that we saw in the section. So in some way, what is the roof is not the limits of the roof. What's the roof material? It's not the limits of where it can be. There's a continual kind of breaking and continuity of the materials in terms of what they are commonly used for. And as one goes more and more to the inside of the project, the color kind of begins to disappear as the kind of distill one's experience towards this moment, seen from stage and the backside. So in some way, it cools down. The totality of the project is only visible in model form. In this case, when we model a dichroic glass, kind of gave us the idea of really shifting that character of that glass surface as one moves around. But it's kind of a tectonic that refuses to be one or the other. It oscillates between, one could say, architectural attitudes, architectural styles. It can be read in ways that are not limited to one, but the entire effort is really setting up those conditions that we see perhaps understood clearly and letting the third condition dictate how they negotiate their differences. The afterlife of this one interesting. The 90% of the images I showed were done 1 year after the competition. The competition had more of a language of the imagery above. Makes you wonder what could have happened, if you kind of produce better images for the competition. But it's something we continually kind of do, like taking old images and reworking, and not necessarily kind of a form of rendering exercise, but to really kind of constructing the images, kind of, in a world of mid-journey, that sounds really kind of laborious, but really kind of looking into the nuances of what each image tells us and what is it that we can get out of it, forgetting there's a reality of it in the 3D model, forgetting that there's the possibility of render, but see how they can collage together to produce perhaps other readings, other potentials for other projects. How are we doing with time? All right. This is the most recent one that we've done. It's totally undercooked. It doesn't necessarily have an argument, but I thought it would be good to kind of take you through something that's just been finished and doesn't necessarily have its kind of arguments fully realized. Post-rationalization, arguing about projects you've done a long time ago is part of what we do. It's part of the fiction. What you initially said is not real. What you initially said is a projection. The idea to kind of continue to project on projects is part of what we do on a daily basis as architects. The site is kind of crazy, former industrial kind of, and the context gives you nothing. Nothing there is there will exist in 5 years. You have nothing to respond to other than the site boundaries. Things are being built, things are being demolished. The nature of this kind of quasi-industrial, future residential, commercial thing is unknown to anyone. 2 mandates in the competition. One is to preserve this building, and the other one is to preserve the missionary buildings that are no longer missionary, but make them part of the museum. And of course, keep this as a park. And there is no other kind of intake for the project on the outside. So in this kind of predicament, like how do you respond architecturally? There is nothing to posture against, there is nothing to respond to. And our kind of idea was to, can we make architecture absence here? Can we not have any expression of facade, envelope towards the site? Using the section of the site to split the two museums. One is an art museum, one is kind of a history of the city museum. Thinking that what could be an art museum goes into the basement as an underground exploration, and what's historic old goes into the attic. So architectural expression was really kind of float an occupiable roof, but really have the park flow between the missionary and what's going to be the main boulevard. And let this kind of be the expression of the project. A roof is always roof. What comes around, what goes around, doesn't really matter. A roof is a roof. The idea of kind of keeping the building, competition said, unless there's a kind of idea that necessitates demolition, you could demolish the floors. We saw no value in reprogramming an old kind of generic modernist building. But we felt it could be kind of interesting if we turned the facade inside out and let the void kind of be the center of the project in the way the spaces in the underground and the spaces in the roof begin to connect through that void. So in some way, having the building fully disappear, but fully engulf its footprint and volume in that cut. Once this is left, the landscape kind of flows. You begin to discover all kinds of cuts that carry in section from below to above. And deeper into the underground, the art museum begins to take shape in the thickness of that ground. The kind of Boolean cuts and the volumes that are placed in those cuts really create a sectional connectivity between those. So if you are kind of in the ground level approaching under the canopy, you begin to encounter these moments that begin to signal there is something below, and seeing through the cut above, there is something above, but what you're supposed to go in is nowhere in sight. The project is kind of organized across the two streets. You can enter both ways as a long corridor to access both museums. On the landscape level, this is what you walk by and have a kind of peek into various conditions which you can enter through a set of voids. Once in the basement, it's a set of enfilades again and elements through which you begin to move in a compartmentalized, flexible and non-flexible galleries. The ones that are in the middle, the one on the lower left is the one that's imaged. A kind of special gallery that begins to push the section, push the ground, kind of establish a datum of the park in a different way as it pressures into the space. Upstairs, the mood is very different. Upstairs is kind of dark, just like heavier tones, where you kind of move in curated set of tables, open space through which you negotiate. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So the building kind of really presents itself just as a roof on columns. There is no expression of it as an enclosure. There are kind of moments within its thickness that you see accessible, and those are the cuts that allow ones to go across. The ambition of this, again, maybe not unlike Kaunas, as you begin to go around, the character of the roof begins to shift from monumental, breaking down to the scale that begins to speak to the missionary homes, which are programmed for art education. One thing that we're trying to kind of really experiment here is how to think about the recent experiments of photogrammetry we've been doing, and how in focus, out of focus, particle versus fully imagined surfaces could be reconciled in image construction. So it's kind of like larger idea in terms of representation is to see if we can tease out a kind of a rendering that begins to move in and out of resolution at varying intensities. the last one, the one that still lives on, at least for now, is the recent competition we won in Korea. It's for the new Agricultural Resources and Management Institute in Gyeongsangbuk-do. If you look at the image of this thing, you would imagine it's the most scientifically advanced kind of thing that's being done. But what's being done, at least on the site, is kind of management of seeds and crops. And this, in a way, I think has an interesting connection to you, Hernan, because this is the second time the competition is running. I believe you were in the first one that got cancelled as a jury. That's it, right? Okay. So, that's right. I figured you would not watch for what we've seen as examples of the first competition. That, in a way, gave us kind of a willingness to kind of experiment and maybe push it, because it is the kind of brief site where we have no knowledge of. The site is in the middle of Korea. It's 3 hours from any metropolitan city. It's in the middle of farmland, where there are 6 villages next to, not far from a highway. And the mandate is, there are 3 different facilities around the region that's being centralized. It's a government project, Public Works. And it's asking to kind of take this site, and you can kind of see the difference in color in the land. The green that surrounds kind of the red tone is where actual farming happens. The other fields are where more managed, careful, curated seed quality and crop quality is handled by the government. So it's a very central system in terms of ensuring quality of seeds. We sketch a ton before things get into the computer. This is not unusual for us to kind of put down as many ideas as possible to kind of exhaust, weed out the bad ones, and see something sticks. And what's at stake was really a program that asked for literally storage for seeds, crops, offices, residences for workers, garage, repair shops, like the kind of typology that you would never ever imagine you would work on as a single entity. It would have been, so instead of thinking, well, we can design this building for this building for this, what are the ways in which we can collect almost all of those things in one building, which could help us organize the site? In some way, there was an initial desire to really like put down our foot on the site as little as possible, but have a big impact in the way the site can be organized and impacted. So the figure is basically the building. It organizes these buildings on the lower left, which were to be kept. The ones on the left are scheduled to be demolished. That was part of the competition. And then really organize the site as 4 different quadrants. A ribbon that kind of self-intersects, that makes a courtyard. Thinking that for different kind of constituencies that can mix in this building, there could be a variety of spaces that don't always end up being in between buildings. Vistas through this building could always be open when one looks to the horizon. This is the reality of the site as it happens there. The first act was to kind of really clear it. Imagine the ground as kind of how the next site is, like really treated within the kind of methods of how they deal with the land as part of the landscape. You saw that, right? Those are the fastest buildings we ever designed. We copied the ones. One is going to be a repair shop. One is going to be where they kind of park them overnight. Agriculture machinery, that is. And that's 30% of the program in terms of square footage. So the idea was like that quadrant has a certain character. We didn't care. We were the ones to contribute to an ongoing character that deviated from what we designed as a building, but it was important that quadrant was coherent in its character. So in some way, the cheapest prefab that is possible was gonna be our kind of attitude. And then our kind of ribbon comes in. The ribbon that negotiates kind of a barn gable on loose ends and self-intersects to make that courtyard. The housing is in the ring, the office is in the intersection, and kind of amenities are down below on the ground level. This is how it begins to kind of sit on the site. The building on the left is a museum building, they call. It's kind of a really building they badly want to keep. So we're renovating that one, parking, etc. Since the competition, the kind of approach to the ribbon has changed. We're a little uncomfortable that it was too singular in its gesture. It was something that kind of easily consumed as a form. So rather than thinking of it as a line that self-intersects, we started thinking of it an intersection of an L and a circle. And that produced just stuff that we didn't kind of imagine during the competition. The other thing with the ribbon was every single roof surface was a ruled surface, kind of resulting in every single structure member kind of being different. And it really focused the complexity on the outside of the ring, where we're dealing with ruled surfaces, conical surfaces on the inside, and planar surfaces everywhere else. And in kind of looking at it in some way, on the eye level, nothing really changes, interestingly. On the kind of drawn view, things get a little bit more volumetric, which we kind of desperately need, actually, for the height of machines that go into some of the storages. One of the other things that was kind of super interesting during the site visit we discovered is that green patch you see in the middle of that site. It's a cold storage space that's just ventilated, but it just retains the coolness of the earth in itself, and it's buried under, it's a concrete structure that's buried basically under earth. It's a very common landscape element, this part of Korea as well, not only for this kind of storage, but tombs, monuments, along with dolmens, which kind of in a weird way inspired us. So when we're kind of looking at this, how do we get this ring to kind of float without kind of over-expressing it? How do we get it to be a little bit precarious, like rest on these berms, columns that are out of phase, seem to be kind of leaning and rocking, one form really that's rotating in multiple ways that hold the ring. This is kind of the approach shot into the courtyard, and the courtyard kind of reveals, which is really the backyard of housing, front yard of offices, entry plaza of the lobby, but also it has a cut that allows you to move diagonally in the site that you can trace in the building. So it's one building, but it's really 7 buildings all together in the way it comes together. The berms are a fitness center and a lounge, restaurant, cafeteria for the workers, field workers that come in kind of rest here, office workers, researchers, etc., all kind of within the organized condition of the circle. Upstairs, kind of moving from residential subdivision to the offices, the intersection of the circle and the L begins to produce spaces that divides the office space, generates pockets of private offices, larger meeting areas, but also allows that space to look deeper into the wings. Just going through some of the stuff gives you the inners. It's a fairly simple building. I mean, the spaces are, we're talking about not many rooms apart from the residences, But every single one begins to produce its own kind of specificity in terms of what it's doing in relationship to everything else. We're currently kind of basically in the process of DD, trying to figure out how we actually get this stuff built. The ambition for the project was rammed earth for all the vertical walls, timber structure. These are the least sustainable things you can do in Korea, apparently. Very expensive to build with wood, very expensive to build with rammed earth. So it was immediately out of question. So we're left with steel and concrete in the way we're building this. But in terms of the character of the ring, kind of shifting from the residential subdivision, the deeper windows for privacy, to the industrial machines, to the scale of things that we don't usually engage on a daily basis. So everything is a bit over scale. The doors are like 20 feet high. The ceilings are tall. The things that people don't use these buildings. They go in and out and park things and drop things. So in some way, the overscaling of elements, the dormers, which we call dormadors, the kind of exaggerated gable, the water runoff, we call them oversized canopies, undersized canopies. But nonetheless, the ends are articulated in a way that reject the building being a terminal cut, but producing a kind of abstraction and producing a singular frontality, which we assume to be kind of the short end of the project. This is how the project kind of sits into various moments from the path, from the apple orchard, etc. And maybe something we started in Kaunas kind of shifts its character as one kind of goes around, moves between typologies that we associate with kind of agricultural, industrial, to potentially other ones. But it's the transformation between those moments that begins to produce perhaps the third condition that I mentioned earlier. In a weird way, maybe just to wrap it up, like competitions is just a word for self-initiated projects. Self-initiated projects can be in all kinds of different forms. And within those projects, there are other projects that emerge. Kind of finding yourself in this kind of situation, we're completely out of our elements. We really don't understand fully, grasp. But that's the moment where kind of maybe desire to experiment comes in handy, and the muscle memory that comes with self-initiated projects allows one to kind of enter and kind of remain, hopefully, right, as a positively operating architect. So that's all I have for you. I went a little bit over, but thank you so much.